So now we're going to kind of talk about what it built upon it. What is Pure doing with vVols? Why are customers looking at vVols again in 2022? So section one, again, Andrew talked about vision and strategy, why we're talking about them. In the previous section, we both kind of talked about VMware and Pure, all of these simple integrations. But let's now kind of talk into why are customers using vVols? What are they actually? What's new? And let's dive into some of those demos that we talked about. And so from a vVol recap, when we kind of think about what are vVols, well, they're essentially a well-orchestrated version of an RDM. And when we think about an RDM, we don't think about that piece of storage that we hated using within vSphere because it was very complicated to manage. We think about an RDM as a raw device mapping. What's important to understand here is since it's a raw device, there's no file system underneath it from a hypervisor perspective. So no VMFS, no NFS. The native guest or the native file system is the guest OS. And where this is very important is for the data mobility aspect of it. It truly becomes portable to be moved from vSphere to Hyper-V to the cloud to a physical server. The things that we see as customers are moving towards this, maybe even Project Monterey, where everything's going back to a physical kind of construct. What can we do to transfer that data everywhere? That is a very important thing to highlight. But what's also important to understand is ingest unmap and all of the things that you natively get with virtual disks. So if we go back traditionally, right, when we think about a virtual disk that's running on VMFS, we can provision it three ways: thin, thick, lazy, thick, eager. But most vendors recommend either thin or thick, eager. Thin if you want all the capacity efficiencies, ingest unmap. If you need raw performance, we'll go thick, eager. It's going to be provisioned. vVols give you the best of both worlds because it is a thin provision disk from a vSphere perspective, but a raw volume. You are truly on the edge of those bleeding high performance applications. So again, another really great place where we see customers adopting that. And when we think about integrated replication management and storage policy-based management, that's really what's setting it apart and allowing us to further build our integrations like that vVol replication manager. And so if we think about what does that application data mobility looks like, right? It's going to take me now to kind of cover that cloud concept. But think about an environment where you have a production system sitting on premises on your flash array. Say this is a database server. All of the important data is sitting on that data set. But what happens when you need to share that data with other users, with other companies, do a cloud burst, bring your test, dev, staging, UAT environments out there? If you try to natively replicate that up to the cloud, it's going to be expensive. It's going to be very rigid and not necessarily be durable. So what we have the ability to do with vVols or RDMs or bare metal volumes is essentially take those data sets that exist on premises, replicate that up to Cloud Block Store, which is our flash array natively in the cloud, in both AWS and Azure, and kind of give you the ability to utilize those clones data sets at a major deduplication, giving you performance efficiencies, capacity efficiencies, all of these that you just don't get natively in the cloud. And even some customers might be using this for DR, replicating their data volumes for their database servers. In a DR scenario, that data is sitting there idle, doing nothing. So a lot of customers are looking to how can they take that DR data sets, clone them for those test dev UAT environments, and then utilize that. So that's really been a large adoption to be able to utilize that and kind of bring that into the environment. And vVols and RDMs really bring that enablement. And so if we take a second look at this slide, well, storage is evolving, right? When we think about the traditional object of a VMFS data store, when you have all of those applications or all of those containers on that single data store, that data store has a fixed SLA. So when you think about this, moving to vVols and those granularity provides flexibility at a storage policy. Instead of having to change the capabilities, you do a policy change versus an actual data move. And so when we kind of think about this, with VMFS, you're provisioning your storage for the infrastructure instead of your applications. And so that becomes very important when we actually think about some of the challenges. And so not only do we have that one-to-one from an SLA, you're limited on what you can do with your applications. But what happens when you have a whole bunch of VMs running on a data store? This goes back to previous sizing. Well, do I have 100 VMs on my data store? Do I have 20? How do I have to appropriately balance them? With vVols, it's a container that runs natively on the array. So you don't have to worry about that of one VM contending over another. Again, we have our always-on QoS, our manual QoS, where you can limit those bad actors. The other complicated thing that provides is the lack of visibility when you're using VMFS data stores. Because when you look at those metrics, you're looking at metrics for the data store. If you see that grow in performance, if you see that grow in capacity, you don't really get those insights because it's really hard to troubleshoot in case something gets added or removed at any point in time. If I think about it this way, I was working with a customer who was experiencing capacity issues. They had a very disjointed team where there were storage admins, vSphere admins, Windows admins, and the end users. And all of a sudden they saw their capacity grow, their data reduction drop. They had no clue what was happening. They're saying, these are just general VDI. And so when we think about this, it took us between moving with all these teams and going back with engineering and all this, because of the lack of visibility into the environment, it took about a week or two to really get down to the raw data, having to go back and forth with different teams offline. I had a similar environment with a customer running vVols, and because they were running vVols, I was able to identify this in about 1 to 2 minutes. I could say it's this VM. It just all of a sudden dropped. I think someone ran BitLocker on it because it went from 15 to 1 to 1 to 1 data reduction. So it provides a lot of that visibility and very ease of troubleshooting because you're seeing what the console shows, not what the individual data stores are. And then what's also important is kind of that protection aspect. Obviously with ransomware and protection, we want to make sure we're doing snapshots and replications. If you apply protection group, well, it's up to the storage admin to make sure it's there. vSphere admin doesn't actually understand what's going on. And so with storage policies, capabilities of the array become storage policies. So if you place that VM in a 1-hour protection group to do snapshots, and someone changes that on the array, the vCenter and the storage policy can say, whoa, this is not in compliant anymore, and I'm going to inform you. And so traditionally providing a lot more insights. And so when we take that one step further, a value-add tool that's completely included with all of our products is virtual machine analytics or VM analytics. It's going to take a lot of that issues and identify it not just at the storage level, but at the full stack level. Give you visibility from the virtual disk to the host, to the volume, to the data store, to the array. And so you can see a full depiction of path of performance, whether it's IOPS, latency, throughputs. We also have some metrics in there for capacity. And so if you're using VMFS, you can get all that granular level metrics. If an application owner comes to you and says, my VM's running slow, well, search for that VM, select it, see the full path, see what other VMs are on it. And you might say, well, the VM is high latency and the host is high latency and there's 100 VMs running on it, then 3 are pegged at 100%. Well, that's going to provide you very easy visibility for this. What's also great is this isn't going to be limited to Pure. You'll still be able to collect all those VM, host, data store metric stats for third-party storage. So if you have a mixed environment, it's going to definitely work from you for that perspective.
Being real, so VCP 3456. I used to make friends when I was in the partner SC side by telling customers about our vTools. You know, it's like, hey, here's this cool free thing. Now I make friends, hopefully other ways too. But the replacement for that for me is actually talking about this because it's free to Pure customers. It's also free for non-Pure customers. They can actually go and download it. And there's actually a little bit of a sneaky but good for everybody approach there. This actually helps troubleshoot problems that are down at the storage layer that may be very challenging otherwise. We have really good solutions at that layer. So if someone's like, oh, it's this free thing that's going to go away and it's not going to be available, there's actually good reasons for us to make it available to non-Pure customers for free. The other way I think about it is sometimes if you've spent your life staring at ESX top over time, this is ESX top actually put into a GUI that makes us much faster to someone walks into your office like, not my fault, or can you come back a little later? Let me do a little more checking, that kind of thing. So I don't want to riff too much on this, but this is just so much fun to talk to people about.
Yeah, and it's also important to understand this isn't going to be the only tool you have available to you. We have a full vRealize operations pack, vRealize log insight. Again, all of those integrations, they come out. So a lot of very detailed metrics. Maybe you have bare metal servers that you're doing in comparison. This one's going to be strictly for VMware only. Again, those other tool sets will work with those other ones.
There's no requirement for vVols to use this, right?
There's no requirement for vVol. So what it's going to do is the column that's blocked is a storage type. So we'll show you vVols, we'll show you RDMs, we'll show you NFS, we'll show you VMFS, and we do that. So it'll kind of give you that depiction of how everything looks, but it can be used for all of our storage.
So you can point down the latency of the kernel to whichever storage, et cetera, et cetera. Full ESX top.
Yep. Well, not full ESX top. It's going to show you the metrics. So
most of the way.
Write latency, read latency.
Storage specific.
Storage specific. And these are all metrics that we collect natively from ESXi and vCenter. So we're not pulling all these storage extra metrics and having to turn all of that. We're just pulling those in, bringing them in, and then being able to present that to you.
So is there an API related to this tool too, so that you could automate things?
So this is more like of a monitoring. So it's part of our Pure 1. So our Pure 1 does have a full API automation. The VM analytics part to be able to pull these are not available yet. the way that this tool is, it's an OVA that gets deployed within your environment, and that OVA collects the VM level metrics against the vCenter, and then the host or the volume and the array information are just part of our telemetry data from our traditional arrays, so those are calculated outside of that.
We actually
My understanding was that this actually is just consuming standard VMware APIs anyway, and yeah,
Exactly.
So I mean, this is a consumer of the APIs, not a provider of the APIs.
Yeah.
We thought about doing long-term retention here. We actually tried that out with some customers. It's actually focused on kind of more real-time performance analysis and troubleshooting. Frankly, it was a way to show off some of what we can do in Pure 1, but also because it consumes the APIs and for real-time troubleshooting.
Yeah.
So you said you don't need to be a customer or Windows.
Nope.
How do people get it?
There's a website.
Website?
You've got to register for a Pure 1 account.
Okay.
Download an OVA, connect them up. If you're comfortable with this stuff, you can do it pretty quickly. But it's I don't think we have a QR code here on link, but there's a QR code at the very end of the presentation that says more info. You can follow the links in there to get it, but publicly available or Googleable. Take your pick.
Yeah. And if they're familiar with their local partner, their local account team, they can help get set up with the account too.
Yes.
Those are always important.
Better answer.
So what is Pure and vVols doing? To kind of, before we talk about what's new, let's again talk about some of those challenges that were observed, right? Obviously, they've been around for a while. Why are we now seeing an uptick in adoption? A lot of them was because there was complexity and misunderstanding of how they actually worked. A lot of this with new automations, new updates have improved the setup. Is some customers are, I heard vVols are very complicated. I'm like, well, we can guide you through a demo. We built a hands-on lab that we worked with some partners to deliver to over 1,000 customers, where if I were to go in just real-time speed, I can configure vVols end-to-end with our plugin in about 2 minutes. And that's with just putting usernames and passwords, mapping it out. It's a very simple standpoint. So a lot of that complexity has now gone, and it's shifted to what applications can I actually run? What's also been kind of a pain was the certificate management, because a lot of the authentication was certificate-based. There wasn't really a good thing built in, and if you used multiple non-linked vCenters, you actually had to replace the VASA certificate to a signed one to make sure that the VMware APIs didn't overwrite it with a VMCA one. So for customers who had these really large environments with multiple arrays and being able to provide only a 2-year or a 1-year thing, it became very difficult to manage at scale because, again, there's not always an API for everything, and there isn't really one for certificates. So as we talk about this, certificate management is something that we are working very closely with on VMware to improve. So a lot of those issues will not happen in the future. Another thing that kind of adopted blocking was the VASA provider, and when that went into a failover state, it provided a gap of when you could actually manage those virtual machines. So when we think about the VASA provider, it's how VMware manages the arrays. If VASA is unavailable, it can't do anything, but all those VMs will still continue to run. And so again, as we focused on from a scale perspective, not just how many objects we can do, but what we can do at performance, what we can do objects, what we can do with snapshots, how we can also include a lot of those SPVM related features. And we spent a lot of time working with VMware on this. And so Andrew's going to kind of paint a picture for us about really what did we see from like a VASA provider release perspective.
So when we were looking at this earlier, we were preparing this morning. What do you know? We were thinking like, do we take you through VASA provider by release? It's like, no, but we'll all go crazy. What you're seeing here is years of weekly, sometimes bi-weekly meetings and collaboration with VMware around this. And this is actually like a serious investment. And this is something that I found, been in a couple different places before Pure and otherwise. And sometimes you look at how much can you justify product management and engineering investments, right? It's got to be based on your customer base, on your TAM, all this stuff. So we're in this unique position because of having a leadership position around VMware. I think that's where Cody has kind of put his dent in the world, if you will, a little bit, like, because that was his goal of doing that. And then continuing on through VASA providers, SRM support, increased object account, especially around the scale pieces, because this gets into like, we actually have to justify and figure out where does our time go. It's not just like hire a random contractor to build stuff. This is pure engineering. It's front-end UI engineering. It's actually the time and the relationships back with VMware. If you've ever done like battling business units in or between organizations, right? There's all this stuff that goes into it. So I realize I'm intentionally not going through all the specific individual items. You can actually find them in the release notes. Alex Carver is here. He lives with that stuff and writes it all out. We've got it all documented out down. But it takes this continuing engineering investment. And we're super fortunate that we have the metrics to be able to continue to justify that back to customers. One last piece here, I think, before demos.
Yep. So I think we're wrapping this up.
Yeah.
So no, not demos. So when we think about the performance, the biggest difference is thinking how vVols and VMFS compare. And one is file system driven, right? And then one is the API driven, because every vVol command is essentially an API.
Mind if I add one thought here? So it's fun sometimes, sorry, from an engineering standpoint. So if there's a sense of, okay, you're a technical customer, maybe you're in the partner vendor pre-sales community, and then you're actually the engineer who does the stuff. And sometimes I work with the engineers that are like, oh, that's not technical at all. Well, it's technical to different people based on what you do kind of thing. So this is an engineering concept that's really fascinating to think about. File system semantics, VMFS, well, what is that like versus doing API calls? Well, that comes with, even if we go back to the days of like SOAP before REST, et cetera, like these are very different things with different levels of overhead. So if you're going to say, I'm going to transfer it from file system semantics over to API calls, AKA VMFS to vVols, that does not come for free. It actually takes a lot of work. Back to you.
Yeah. No, and when Andrew's the hype man for the strategy stuff. And so when we think about what are some of the things that were those challenges and how were they resolved? Well, operations took a little bit more time when utilizing those older VASA providers. What we actually did was think about this co-engineering with VMware that we've done. It wasn't us having to do changes, it wasn't them, but it's items that we had to do together. So managed snapshots and taking snapshots on all these operations are very demanding on that VASA provider. So what we did is we took a lot of time during that 2 years that our engineering teams worked together and saw what can we do to look at every piece of that workflow and see a lot of that stuff was serialized. And so you could do a lot, but it took longer. We looked at how can we actually batch that together and make them parallelized to be able to run all of those operations in a time. And so what we saw were some really dramatic situations. Some snapshots and things took 2 to 3 times longer. When we actually looked at some managed snapshots of performance systems, in 6.7, it was almost 100 times increase. So it really varied across the entire stack. Is as we improved this, we improved it just not for Pure, but also all of the other vendors that were out there. And so this really helps that adoption to, again, some customers are using this for some small environments, some customers are doing this at scale. And so it helps them provide the ability to even bring further items at scale. So we did kind of jump into quick demos. These are going to be 3 very quick ones. The first one we're going to talk about is vVol Replication Manager. And this isn't going to be a replacement for SRM. SRM has its really great use case, right? It handles the orchestration, re-IPing, runbooks, all of that. But what the vVol Replication Manager will do is actually use the integrated API management of what vCenter has to go ahead and handle that replication and provide you a user interface in front of it. Because if not, the only way to do that was with that. Is it not coming up?
Nope, I'll drag it up. I was waiting for you to be ready.
So when we think about this, I have a VM that's part of a 1-hour protection group going from my M70 to my C60 array. We can see here I have one virtual machine in here. And so we have the ability to execute a synchronization and have that automatically make sure we're replicating over the data set. Maybe this is a planned failover. And so what we do here is as we're going to come through, I'm going to run a failover. Select the target array because I can have faulty targets. Specify the replica. I can pick any point in time that is part of that workflow, so I'm not only failing over the latest one. Picking a compute resource, picking a network because maybe it's the DR site and we don't want to mix it, or maybe I'm failing it over locally. It would have really bring up that VM instantly, power it on, and hit finish. And so during this time, this handles powering off the source machine, executing the failover, updating all the files, registering the VMs. Almost kind of think about it as like an SRM Lite version, but it's utilizing all the greatness that VMware provides. Because with vVols, there's no SRA, there's no storage replication adapter. It's all native VASA services, and so this gives us the capability to do this. What happens is once it's failed over, well, we'll see now it's in a failed over state. If we navigate to that replication group, we now can handle the reprotection and again, fail back at a later point in time. So again, everything we're doing just natively within the vSphere client, no Purity UI, no APIs up front, really very friendly to the end user. Well, as we reprotect it, we're going to go ahead and select the reverse replication policy to make sure that not only is it just running there, but it's being brought back in the fashion that we need.
Has anyone done this in the past where that was an insane number of steps, especially the reprotect? Oh, maybe. I have.
It was about like 20, I think in the streamlined version, it was about like 20 lines of Power CLI code, and it was not really a lot of insights you can see into it. The next one we're doing, I think, is vVol Insights. So vVol Insights are building upon the information that you can see within the vSphere client. So here we have an Ubuntu Linux machine that we're running. And again, it's running on vVols. We have a bunch of disks. We have the ability to look at the guest metrics, the guest-ridden data. So what's really important is looking at, when you think about a thin provisions array from a data store, is what is actually consumed from the VM level all the way down to the array. And so what these metrics provide you is 250 gigabyte disk that has 118 gigabytes written, but because of our global deduplication and what we do from a compression, it's writing 107 gigabytes to the array, but because of the deduplication, we're only storing 18, which is kind of providing is with this VM, I'm only using a subset of the data it actually needs. If you have an array being filled up with capacity, well, we have the ability to granularly look at it and says, well, if I'm going to move this VM, I'm only going to free up 20 gigs of space versus maybe moving a VM that utilizing larger. And we can look at all of those trends over time built into this. And then if we continue it, not only can we see this from a capacity perspective from a disk, we can see it for the entire VM, but we can also depict the performance graphs of it. And what's important here is it's not what vSphere thinks it's seeing with some of that overhead. It's the actual graphs raw from the array of what the array thinks. So you're seeing real-time metrics for the storage.
So the array doesn't care about the MLC or TLC or whatever is back end of it, and with the RAID level, it just abstracts it with the vVol, right?
Yep.
And then you get the business and technical impact of that action right away, right?
Yeah, and you're getting all this granularity because again, the two things that I like to focus on with vVols is granularity and policy management, is getting to see all of these metrics. So it's normally with VMFS, you have a data store. That is your rigid
You
concept.
can do an SPBM migration.
Yep. All it is you change the policy. You don't have to move any data around. So it's really important when we think about that is, again, with being able to offload everything to array with like Xcopy and VAI, with VMFS file systems, it made that real easy. You still had to move it, but it wasn't always the case. With this, it's literally right-click, change, do that policy, and understand what that actually is. Build on QoS, snapshots and replication.
How complicated and time-consuming is it for a customer to convert their existing VMs that are on VMFS on a flash array to vVols?
Oh, that's very important. So the best part about vVols, and since they're integrated, it's a storage vMotion. So move from VMFS to vVols, no conversion, no changes necessary. It automatically converts to a VMDK.
Yeah,
From
SPBM management migration.
Exactly.
Instant storage vMotion thanks to VAI that basically just happens via metadata move.
Yeah, and when we think about it, going from VMFS to vVols, it is going to be accelerated copy. But when you move from vVols back to VMFS, again, you use it, you tested it, it didn't work, or you wanted to move back. It's again just a traditional copy, but it's still done effectively.
Do you optimize it with the unique TCP/IP stack dedicated for migration, or use a vMotion TPC stack, or does it matter?
It doesn't really matter. So really what it comes down to is the setup of your environment. If we kind of go in there, and luckily VMware now has the provisioning TCP/IP stack, which is amazing because tons of customers still have 1 gig management networks, and they're like, I'm moving this VM and it's really, really slow. I have 10 gig vMotion NICs. Why isn't it faster? And it's because understanding powered off versus powered on VMs and what stack it's using is a really important way to isolate that.
So did VMware actually implement a change data store via VOSA call?
Not a change data store VOSA call, but when you're doing the conversion, it knows that it's within the same array and the blocks are there, so it has the ability to kind of handle that conversion.
Okay, because it's, I mean, part of it was, so it will be reasonably instantaneous, but it still ends up being a SCSI call to make, to actually attempt to move the data. Is we actually pushed for VMware to actually have a change data store call. But
So Andy, so think of it with a flash array in VAI, as David shared, we've got the intelligence to understand the data's already there, so we don't have to write it, right? We're just changing it from a VMware presentation layer, where without that, we would literally have the data on disk, write the data on disk, and then deduplicate and compress the data against itself again. So it's eliminating all the overhead.
Oh, okay, I understand eliminating the overhead. It's just, it still has to be implemented through a SCSI Xcopy call. Okay, got it.
Perfect. And then as we kind of wrap this up, not only can we see the monitoring aspects, we can see the configuration aspect, which again adds more. Not only can we see the virtual device, the size, the data store, the array, the volume, but we actually get insights into the new metrics. How much space is actually consumed on what partition down to the OS, so you can see where all of those mounts live. And so kind of now we're going to kind of jump in, very quickly revert where you shut down the VM, right click, recover from snapshot, pick that point in time snapshot, whether it's the most recent, maybe it's a week ago. In one click, you're reverting the entire VM, and you also have the ability to recover that entire VM. Not only is this available for vVols today, but it's going to also be available for the VMFS workflow in the future. So a very simple, quick workflow. And so kind of as we're wrapping this up, Andrew's going to kind of talk about real quick what is next.
It's actually kind of exciting. There is, so I think we're going back and forth, Vong, a little bit on the actual release date of vVols, or when they're called virtual volumes, et cetera, kind of thing. This has been happening for a while, but there's actually more engineering work going on from Pure and VMware than ever before here. So it's focused on a lot around Pure and VMware design partnerships. There's actually some sessions later this week that you can go listen to, hopefully make sure to attend. A lot of work going around stretched storage support. This is like stretched clusters, VMSC, that kind of stuff, right? Performance and scale. That's not done. It only continues to go further. Customers push it further. They want to push things further, as well as, last but not least, of course, NVMe over Fabrics is actually a solution to a problem whose time has come, actually, I think, in the data center, like over the fabric side, not inside the array.
You misspelled NVMe over TCP.
Rocky, or actually, so the one I like most is doing Rocky, and then I play like nested acronym games. So it's RDMA into Rocky and et cetera. But yes, which one is going to rule the world? So NVMe over Fabrics. But the core pieces here at a Pure level, we are investing a lot into this, as well as jointly with VMware, which is kind of fun. This is like cool stuff to geek out about down the stack. It has application and impact from an infrastructure, folks. That's where a lot of this grew up. It has application all the way up into a data mobility layer. That goes into cloudy type stuff and application benefits. There's more info. Lots of public resources. There's a QR code. Have fun.